Yaren exhaled sharply, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit as he stepped into the dimly lit restaurant. A blind date. He still couldn't believe he had agreed to this. His best friend had insisted he needed to get out of his own way, stop treating love like another business transaction. Just one night, his friend had said, no pressure, just meet her. Yaren had built his fortune on strategic decisions, never leaving things to fate. But somehow tonight he had allowed himself to be set up with a total stranger. He scanned the restaurant, his sharp eyes landing on a woman sitting alone at a corner table. A red dress, simple yet striking, hugged her figure. Her dark curls cascaded over one shoulder, and even from a distance she had an air of quiet confidence. He stepped forward, Raina. She looked up, her deep brown eyes widening slightly before she smiled. You must be Yaren. Her voice was warm, smooth, a contrast to the nervous energy radiating from her. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, noting the slight tremble in her fingers as she reached for her water glass. So, she said, clearing her throat, blind dates, do you do this often? That made him chuckle. Not at all, first time actually. Same here, she admitted. I almost backed out, but my friend practically pushed me into the cab. He arched an eyebrow. Should I be flattered or concerned? She laughed, and something about the sound made his chest tighten. Flattered, I think, but I won't lie, this is a little intimidating. You seem, well, polished. Polished? She gestured vaguely at him. The suit, the watch, the way you walked in like you own the place. He didn't tell her that he actually did own the place. That was a conversation for later. And you, he asked, intrigued by the way she carried herself. You don't seem the type to be intimidated easily. Her smile softened. I work as a nurse. I spend most of my days in the ER. It takes a lot to shake me, but blind dates are a different kind of pressure. A nurse? That explained the quiet strength in her eyes. He had spent years surrounded by people who were either trying to impress him or take advantage of his wealth. But Raina, she was different. She had no idea who he was, and yet she met his gaze with a steady, unpretentious openness. The waiter arrived, and Yaren barely glanced at the menu before ordering the restaurant's signature steak. Raina hesitated, then ordered something modest. Get whatever you want, he said. She smiled. I don't need the most expensive thing on the menu to enjoy a meal. He liked that. As the night unfolded, the conversation flowed effortlessly. She told him about the chaos of working in the ER, the long hours, the emotional toll. But she also spoke about the moments that made it all worth it, the patients she had helped, the lives she had saved. And you, she asked, resting her chin on her hand, what do you do? He hesitated. He could tell her the truth that he was a millionaire, that his name was on half the skyscrapers in the city. But for the first time in years, he didn't want his wealth to define the interaction. I'm in business, he said vaguely. She narrowed her eyes playfully. That is the vaguest answer I've ever heard. He chuckled. What can I say? I like to keep a little mystery. The night stretched on, the tension between them shifting from awkward to something else entirely, something magnetic. He found himself leaning in closer, drawn to the way she spoke, the way she laughed, the way she looked at him like he was just a man, not a millionaire, not a businessman, just Yaren. By the time dessert arrived, he realized something unsettling. He hadn't checked his phone once. For a man who lived by his schedule, who thrived on control, that was unheard of. You're different, he said suddenly, watching as she took a bite of her chocolate mousse. She raised an eyebrow. Different how? I don't know yet, he admitted, but I want to find out. A flicker of something passed through her eyes, surprise, maybe even something deeper. Before he could overthink it, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. She didn't pull away. And just like that, Yaren knew. He had come here expecting nothing. Instead, he was falling for her before the night even ended. Yaren walked Raina to the curb, the city's evening hum surrounding them. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain on the horizon. He wasn't ready for the night to end, but he also wasn't the type to push. If she wanted to go home, he'd let her. This was, she started, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. Unexpected, he supplied. She laughed softly. Yeah, but in a good way. Her honesty was refreshing. He was used to calculated conversations, people maneuvering around him with hidden agendas. But with Raina, there was only sincerity. A car pulled up when she had clearly called beforehand. He opened the door for her, waiting as she hesitated. Something flickered in her expression, like she was debating something internally. Then she looked up at him. "Would you want to do this again?" The question sent a thrill through him, though he kept his voice even. "Absolutely." Her lips parted slightly as if surprised by his certainty. "Okay," she said, ducking into the car. "Good night, Yaren." He watched her leave, an unfamiliar warmth settling in his chest. The next morning, Yaren sat in his office, staring blankly at the reports in front of him. The numbers, projections, and contracts usually commanded his full attention, but today his mind was elsewhere. On a woman who had no idea she had dined with a millionaire the night before. A knock disrupted his thoughts. His assistant Ava stepped in, her sharp eyes scanning him. "You're distracted." Yaren leaned back in his chair. "I met someone." Ava's brows lifted slightly, the closest thing to surprise she ever showed. Someone important. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Potentially." She tilted her head, clearly analyzing him. "And does she know who you are?" "No." Ava sighed. "So you're keeping it from her?" "It's not like that," he said. Just last night I wasn't a millionaire or a CEO or whatever else people label me. Was just a guy on a date. I don't want to ruin that." Ava crossed her arms. "It won't stay a secret forever." "I know." She studied him for another moment before nodding. "Then I hope she's worth it." He already knew she was. Raina stood outside the cafe, her phone in hand, debating whether to text him first. The date had been perfect, too perfect. She wasn't used to things feeling effortless, especially not with men like him. He had an air of quiet confidence, but not the kind that veered into arrogance. Finally, her phone buzzed. "Dinner tonight." Her lips curved into a smile. "Only if I get to pick the place this time." That evening, Yaren found himself in a small, family-owned restaurant tucked into an unassuming street. The warm scent of spices filled the air, and the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the high-end places he usually frequented. Raina was already waiting for him, waving him over with a grin. "I figured I'd introduce you to one of my favorite spots." He slid into the seat across from her. "I like it." The night unfolded with the same ease as before. She talked about her day at the hospital, the chaos and victories, while he listened, genuinely invested. When she asked about his work, he gave careful answers, enough to satisfy without revealing too much. As they ate, a sudden downpour began outside, the rain slamming against the windows. Raina laughed. "Guess we're stuck here for a while." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I can think of worse places to be." Her laughter faded slightly, her expression softening. Something had shifted between them. The first date had been discovery, but this was something deeper. And Yaren knew without a doubt that he was in trouble. Yaren had never been the type to lose focus, but in the days that followed his second date with Raina, he found himself distracted in ways he hadn't been before. Meetings blurred together, contracts that once demanded every ounce of his attention now felt secondary. His mind kept drifting to the way she tilted her head when she listened, the way her laughter felt like a force strong enough to shake his carefully controlled world. It had only been 2 dates, and yet she was under his skin. That evening he picked her up from the hospital, leaning casually against his car as she stepped outside. The exhaustion in her posture was evident, but when she saw him, her expression brightened and something deep inside him tightened. "Tough shift?" he asked, opening the passenger door for her. She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "You have no idea." He didn't press for details. Instead, he drove them to a quiet rooftop lounge overlooking the city. The view stretched wide, the skyline illuminated against the darkening sky. When she stepped out, her eyes widened in appreciation. "This is beautiful," she murmured. He watched her take it in, the city lights reflecting in her gaze. "Figured you could use a change of scenery." They settled into a secluded booth, music humming softly in the background. For once, he wasn't thinking about business or strategy or the next move. He was just here with her, and that was enough. You always know the perfect place to take someone, she noted, sipping from her drink. He hesitated for half a second before responding, like making people feel comfortable. She studied him, her expression thoughtful. You do that well, but I get the feeling you don't let many people get close. The observation was so accurate, it nearly threw him off balance. Most people never looked deep enough to notice. I prefer control, he admitted. It's easier that way. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. And yet you keep showing up. It wasn't a question, but it didn't need to be. He held her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. So do you. A small smile tugged at her lips, but before she could respond, a voice interrupted them. Oh, Yaren. He tensed instantly. Turning, he found himself face to face with a man from his business circles, someone who very much knew who he was. The man's eyes flicked to Raina, curiosity sparking. Didn't expect to see you here. Busy week, I assume. Yaren remained composed, something like that. The man nodded, but his gaze lingered on Raina. And you ours. She smiled politely, Raina. The man glanced between them, realization dawning. Well, I'll leave you to it, he said, a knowing glint in his eye before he walked away. Raina turned to him, brow slightly furrowed. That felt odd. Yaren exhaled slowly. He could feel the moment slipping, the weight of what he hadn't told her pressing against his chest. There's something I need to tell you, he said, his voice steady despite the unease tightening around him. She set her glass down, okay. He met her gaze, the truth sitting on the tip of his tongue. But before he could speak, the sky rumbled and a sudden gust of wind swept through the rooftop. The first drops of rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier. Raina laughed, tilting her face upward. Guess we have a habit of being caught in the rain. He watched her for a moment before standing. Come on. Instead of heading for shelter, he led her onto the open terrace. She followed without hesitation, letting the rain soak into her hair, her dress. You're not running for cover, she teased. He shook his head, the weight of his unspoken words momentarily forgotten. Not this time. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. The city stretched below them, the rain falling in steady sheets, but none of it mattered. For the first time in years, Yaren felt truly untethered, and it had everything to do with the woman standing in front of him. Yaren had never struggled with words before, but as he stood in the rain with Raina, her fingers tangled with his, the truth lodged itself in his throat. He had to tell her. He wanted to tell her. Yet for a moment longer, he let himself exist in this space, the world blurred by raindrops, her laughter light against the night, the warmth of her hand anchoring him. Finally he exhaled, Raina, there's something you should know about me. She tilted her head, rain tracing down her cheek like silver threads. Okay, she said, voice steady, inviting the truth rather than bracing for it. His pulse thrummed. I wasn't completely honest about my job. Her brows lifted slightly, but she didn't pull away. What do you mean? He ran a hand through his soaked hair. I don't just work in business. I own several companies, investments, properties, ventures across different industries. He hesitated before adding, I'm a millionaire, Raina. She blinked, absorbing his words, and then, to his complete astonishment, she burst into laughter. His stomach tightened. You're laughing. She placed a hand on his chest, shaking her head. I knew something was different about you, the way you carry yourself, the places you take me, the fact that you don't blink twice at $100 steak. Her fingers curled slightly against his shirt. I didn't know exactly what it was, but I knew you weren't just some ordinary guy. Relief unfurled in him, but uncertainty still lingered. And that doesn't change anything for you. She searched his face and shook it. He faltered for the first time in a long time. It usually does. Her expression softened. Yaren, I liked you before I knew. If anything, I appreciate that you didn't lead with it. The tightness in his chest loosened and something deeper settled in its place. He hadn't expected this. He had prepared for shock, doubt, maybe even a step back, but not this her unwavering steadiness, her quiet acceptance. A slow, disbelieving smile spread across his face. "You're full of surprises." She grinned, "So are you." The rain continued to fall, but neither of them moved. The city pulsed around them, neon lights reflecting in puddles, the distant hum of traffic a backdrop to the moment stretching between them. And then, without hesitation, he cupped her face and kissed her. The world narrowed to the warmth of her lips, the way she melted into him without hesitation. Rain soaked through their clothes, but he didn't care. He pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, pouring every unspoken word into it. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, she rested her forehead against his. "So, what now?" He brushed a thumb along her cheek, his mind already made up. "Now I make sure this doesn't end." Her lips curled into a smile, and just like that, he knew he had fallen harder than he ever thought possible. And for once, he wasn't afraid of it. Yaren wasn't a man who second-guessed himself. Yet, as he sat across from Raina in a private dining room of an upscale restaurant, he found himself wondering how one blind date had unraveled every carefully constructed defense he had. She was radiant tonight not because of the elegant navy dress she wore, but because of the effortless way she carried herself. He had courted wealth, power, and influence his entire life, but never had he been drawn to someone the way he was drawn to her. And she still didn't treat him any differently, not after learning the truth about his fortune. "I have a confession," Raina said suddenly, setting down her fork. He lifted an eyebrow. "That sounds serious." She laughed softly, "Not exactly, just spent all day thinking about how crazy this is." His chest tightened. "Crazy how?" She tilted her head, studying him. "Crazy that I agreed to a blind date and somehow ended up sitting here with you, that it feels like we've known each other longer than we have." He exhaled slowly, running a hand along the rim of his glass. "It doesn't feel rushed to me." Her lips parted slightly as if surprised by his certainty. "No." He shook his head. "Don't waste time on things that don't matter, Raina, and this," he gestured between them, "this matters." A flicker of something passed through her eyes, something unguarded. "That's terrifying," she admitted. "Why?" She hesitated before answering. "Because it means I have something to lose." Yaren reached across the table, brushing his fingers over hers. "So do I." Her breath caught slightly, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over, lacing their fingers together. The moment stretched between them, unspoken understanding settling in. Then a voice interrupted. "Yaren, I didn't expect to see you here." He turned, his jaw tightening as he faced an older man approaching the table. A business associate, one who was known for prying into matters that weren't his concern. The man's gaze flicked to Raina, his expression calculating. "And this must be someone special." Yaren's grip on Raina's hand tightened slightly. "She is." Raina, to her credit, remained composed. "Nice to meet you." The man gave a thin smile. "Pleasure's mine. Yaren doesn't usually bring company to these kinds of places." Yaren's patience thinned. "We were just finishing dinner." The man chuckled. "I won't keep you then, just remember the world is always watching, Yaren." With that, he walked off, leaving his words hanging in the air. Raina let out a slow breath. That was something. He studied her, searching for any sign of discomfort. "Are you okay?" She nodded, but there was a weight behind her eyes. "I knew being with you meant stepping into a different world, just didn't realize how much of it is under scrutiny." He exhaled, turning her hand over in his. "I won't let any of it touch you, you have my word." She glanced at their joined hands, then back at him. "I don't need protection, Yaren, just need honesty." His chest tightened at the quiet strength in her voice. "You have that too." She searched his gaze for a long moment before nodding. "Then I think I can handle whatever comes next." And just like that, he knew no matter what the world threw at them, he wasn't letting her go. Yaren had always been a man who moved with purpose. Every decision, every step, every carefully calculated risk, it was all deliberate. Yet, as he stood outside Raina's apartment building that evening, waiting for her to open the door, he realized something unsettling. He wasn't in control of this. He wasn't strategizing, wasn't planning his next move like he would in business. With her, there were no careful calculations, only instinct, only the undeniable certainty that he wanted her in his life. The door swung open, revealing Raina in a soft, oversized sweater that hung loosely over her frame. She looked surprised to see him, but her expression warmed almost instantly. "You didn't tell me you were coming," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I didn't plan to," he admitted, following her inside. "I just needed to see you." She studied him for a moment, then motioned toward the couch. "Well, you're here now." He sat down, watching as she curled up beside him, tucking her legs beneath her. The apartment was modest but cozy, filled with little personal touches, a stack of medical journals on the coffee table, a blanket draped over the armrest, framed pictures of her family lining the shelves. This was her world, one that had nothing to do with money or power, and he wanted to be a part of it. She exhaled, brushing a hand through her hair. "You're thinking about something." He hesitated, then decided against holding anything back. "I don't want this to be temporary, Raina." Her breath hitched slightly, but she didn't look away. "Neither do I." Relief coursed through him, stronger than he expected. He reached for her hand, running his thumb over her knuckles. "Then let's stop pretending this is just something casual." She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "I don't think we've been pretending very well." He chuckled. "No, we haven't." A comfortable silence settled between them, the weight of unspoken emotions filling the space. After a moment, she leaned into his side, resting her head against his shoulder. "I like this," she murmured. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Me too." And just like that, the last of his doubts faded. 2 weeks later, Yaren stood at the edge of a sprawling garden, the scent of fresh jasmine lingering in the air. The private estate belonged to a close associate, and the evening's charity gala was one of the most exclusive events of the year. Raina stood beside him, her deep emerald dress flowing elegantly around her as she scanned the glittering crowd. "This is a lot," she admitted, keeping her voice low. He turned to her, his gaze steady. "If it's too much, we can leave." She shook her head. "No, I want to be here with you." His chest warmed at her words. As they moved through the crowd, whispers followed them. He wasn't surprised his presence was always noted at events like this, but tonight the attention was different. People were curious about her, about the woman who had captured his attention. A woman approached them, her gown shimmering under the chandelier lights. "Yaren," she greeted smoothly before turning to Raina, "and you must be the reason he's been avoiding half his business meetings lately." Raina blinked, caught off guard, but quickly recovered. "I'm Raina," she said, offering a polite smile. The woman's gaze flickered between them before she gave an approving nod. "Interesting choice, Yaren." He stiffened slightly at the implication, but before he could respond, Raina spoke. "I'd say the same about him," she said, her tone light but firm. The woman let out a surprised laugh. "I like her," she said, before sauntering off into the crowd. Yaren turned to Raina, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Impressive." She shrugged. "I work in an ER. I'm used to handling difficult personalities." He laughed. "You're handling this better than I expected." She glanced at him, something unreadable in her expression. "I know what I signed up for, Yaren. I just need to know you're in this with me." His expression turned serious. "I am completely." She held his gaze for a moment before nodding. And just like that, the tension eased. Later that night, as they left the gala, Yaren guided her toward a waiting car, but instead of opening the door, he hesitated. "Come with me somewhere," he said. She frowned, aware. "Oh, you'll see." Oh, she didn't question it. 20 minutes later, they arrived at a private balcony overlooking the city skyline. The view stretched endlessly, lights twinkling like scattered diamonds. Raina stepped forward, leaning against the railing. "This is beautiful." He didn't look at the view, he looked at her. I brought you here because this is where I come when I need to think, he admitted. She turned to face him, curiosity in her eyes. And what are you thinking about now? He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Her breath hitched. I've spent my life making decisions based on logic, he said. But you are the first decision I've made purely because my heart demanded it. She stared at him, emotion flickering across her face. He opened the box, revealing a delicate ring. Marry me, Raina. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled through them. Yes. The word barely left her lips before he pulled her into his arms, capturing her mouth in a kiss that sealed everything. This wasn't just a moment. This was forever.